Søren Kierkegaard was born on the 5th of May 1813 in Copenhagen. His father had been a feudal laborer in church lands and had so hated his work that one day he walked to the top of a hill and solemnly cursed God. At the age of 21, his father was released from his vassalage and moved to Copenhagen, where he became rich as a wholesaler. He never was able to shake off the guilt he felt for cursing God, a guilt that was only compounded by the early deaths of five of his seven children and of his wife as well. This guilt gave him a somber disposition, which he passed on to Kierkegaard, along with a strict religious upbringing. Kierkegaard spent a great deal of his youth as a man about town and a student studying for a degree in theology. In 1840, he became engaged to a young woman named Regine Olsen, and a year later, shortly before receiving his doctorate, he broke off the engagement quite suddenly. Though the reasons were not clear even to himself, it seems he felt his ethical obligation to her as a husband and as a good citizen could not be reconciled with his higher literary and intellectual obligations. Soon after the break, he began writing at a prodigious rate. Fear and Trembling is one of his earlier works, published in 1843 on the same day as another of his books, Repetition. He became increasingly frustrated with the hypocrisy of the Danish church, and his feud with the clergy exploded into an open and very cutting exchange of pamphlets and editorials. Kierkegaard poured what was left of his considerable inheritance into funding the publication of pamphlets against the church, and in 1855 he collapsed in the street and died of a lung infection on the 11th of November. Fear and Trembling opens with a preface by the pseudonymous author Johannes de Silencio, which discusses the modern world's cavalier attitude toward doubt and faith. Today, he suggests, everyone is unwilling to stop with doubt but wants to go further, as if doubt itself were something easily attained. Descartes attained doubt, but only by means of a long and difficult process following years of study. The Greek skeptics considered doubt to be a matter that takes a lifetime to acquire. People today want to start at this point, the point Descartes attained only by denying himself everything. Today, he suggests, further, everyone is unwilling to stop with faith, but wants to go further, as if faith itself was something easily attained. Faith was once considered a task for a lifetime, but today all people seem to assume they have it, since they all seem to want to go further. All of Kierkegaard's major philosophical works are written pseudonymously, with authorial personas such as Vigilius Hofnensis, Johannes Climacus, and Constantine Constantius. Fear and Trembling is the only book authored by Johannes de Silencio, which literally means John of Silence. Alastair Hannay identifies the name as a reference to a character of that name in the grim fairy tale called The Faithful Servant. The John in this fairy tale was the servant to a young king and warned his master of three dangers, knowing full well that he would be turned to stone for having spoken. Later, the king sacrificed his two sons in order to bring John back to life, and once restored, John resurrected the two sacrificed sons. We may interpret the name and the allusion Kierkegaard has chosen on a number of levels. Most immediately, the name connects with what the author has to say about faith. Faith is regarded as something that cannot be intelligibly explained, understood, or spoken about. Johannes is a very talkative, eloquent author, and yet he is of silence, because the one subject he most wants to discuss, faith, is beyond the power of his words. The John of Silence from the fairy tale can also connect to our author in two ways. The first we see in the preface, as Johannes suggests that his writings are likely to be met with critical disdain or incomprehension, if they are to be met at all. Like the character in the fairy tale, he speaks the truth and warns against the complacency of the age and is likely to be rewarded with deadening silence. This prediction is somewhat prophetic. Kierkegaard was largely ignored and reviled when not ignored during his lifetime. His fame would not come until the 20th century, long after his death. We also see in the fairy tale the theme of repetition emerging, where the young king can regain his sons after having sacrificed them, just like In Fear and Trembling, we're going to talk about the story of Abraham and Isaac. When when Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac did he regain Isaac. The discussion in the preface of Doubt and Faith are meant as a direct critique of the Hegelian system that dominated the philosophy of the day. For Hegel, faith is lower than reason since it is immediate and requires no reflection at all. Faith is then something that we must move beyond, according to Hegel, if we are to understand the world correctly. Similarly, doubt is associated with Descartes by the Hegelians and is considered an earlier stage in the dialectical process that leads to the Hegelian system. This doubt is a starting point that must also be moved beyond. Johannes contrasts the easy intellectualizing of the Hegelians with the dedication required by true doubters and believers. The ancient skeptics, for instance, maintained that since nothing is certain, they should suspend judgment about everything. Learning to suspend judgment took a lifetime of dedicated asceticism, since we are naturally accustomed to passing judgments on the things that we sense and think about. Similarly, the faith required of Abraham was not a simple matter to be had and then moved beyond. Abraham's faith had to be so strong that he would unquestioningly sacrifice his only son to God. The difference between these people and the Hegelians can be understood as a distinction between knowing with one's mind and knowing with one's heart. We might draw the analogy to our consciousness of death. We all know that we will die, but young people tend only to know this with our minds. We know it as a fact and we would never deny it. However, only old people or those who have had a near death experience might know this with their heart, that they are going to die. That is, they are conscious of their mortality in a way that informs their daily actions and their attitude toward life. Johannes sees this contrast as one between reflection and passion. The Hegelians may think they have reasoned through faith and doubt in the same way that think their system allows them to reason through everything else. However, faith and doubt, unlike science or logic, are meaningless and void without passion. We cannot allow Descartes to do our doubting for us. In order to appreciate what it means to doubt, we need to go through the process ourselves. Anything less will lead to cheap theorizing that doesn't understand the objects of its theories. By rationalizing doubt and faith, by rendering them as parts of a system built fully by reflection, Hegelians have destroyed doubt and faith, have rendered them impotent. Kierkegaard is a staunch opponent of the Danish church of his day, feeling that faith has been reduced to an aesthetic level which cheapens the true value of religious passion. The first section of the book is a short one entitled Exordium. It tells the story of a man who deeply admires the story of Abraham in Genesis 22, admiring it more and more as he grows older, but understanding it less and less. More than anything, this man wants to witness the event, to watch Abraham, in order to understand how Abraham did what he did. The man ponders over four possible scenarios. In the first, Abraham explains to Isaac that he is to be sacrificed, but then pretends to be a homicidal psychopath so that his son will blame Abraham and not God for his death and not lose faith in God. In the second, Abraham did what God told him to do, but because he could not understand God's command in ethical terms, he saw joy no more. In the third, Abraham understands God's command as a test of his ethical view and begs God's forgiveness for having even considered sacrificing Isaac. In the fourth scenario, Abraham follows God's command, but he's filled with anxiety and is visibly trembling, which makes Abraham lose faith as well as Isaac. Johannes tells us that the man ponders these and many other scenarios, never managing to fully understand Abraham. He fails to understand how Abraham acted as he did because he fails to understand the faith required. The fact of the matter is that Abraham's faith is beyond comprehension, and any kind of rational scenario that we construct will be unable to bring us beyond an ethical understanding of Abraham. The remainder of Fear and Trembling is given over to a series of three problemata, which are prefaced by a preliminary expectoration. The ethical expression of Abraham's behavior is that he tried to murder Isaac. The religious expression of his behavior is that he tried to sacrifice Isaac. Any murderer can emulate Abraham on an ethical level, but to emulate him on a religious level requires faith. If he were to speak about Abraham, Johannes suggests that first he would say that Abraham was God-fearing. Otherwise, God would not have tested him. Second, he would describe in detail the love Abraham had for Isaac, a love far greater than the usual love between father and son. Third, he would note that Abraham was free at every moment to change his mind and not sacrifice Isaac. Fourth, Johannes would remark that he himself is not a man of faith, and that though he can speak about Abraham, he cannot emulate him. Johannes complains that no one praises faith. We assume that having faith is easy compared to doing philosophy, but Johannes remarks he can understand Hegel but not Abraham. Philosophy is not faith, nor can it give us faith, nor can it convince us that faith is worthless. Johannes remarks once more that he is not a man of faith, and were he in Abraham's shoes, he would not have behaved as Abraham did. He would be capable of following God's command, but he would also think all is lost and be sad that he has to sacrifice his son. He would resign himself to his fate, but this resignation would simply be a substitute for faith. Further, if he loved his son as Abraham had, he would not have gone in the first place. Lastly, if he had done as God had said and received Isaac back at the last minute, he would never be able to overcome the pain of the whole experience and would have trouble being happy with Isaac. Johannes characterizes Abraham as having faith by virtue of the absurd. In saying that Abraham has faith by virtue of the absurd, Johannes says that Abraham's faith transcends all human and intelligible possibility. There is absolutely no intelligible way that Abraham will get Isaac back, and yet he maintains his faith. Faith goes beyond all reason and everything that can be said or understood. In that sense, faith is absurd. It cannot be explained and it cannot be justified. Johannes marks three stages of existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. Because both the religious and the aesthetic place their emphasis on the single individual as opposed to the ethical's emphasis on the universal, there is a worry that the aesthetic may be confused for the religious. The aesthetic is easily attained, whereas the religious requires the double movement of faith. In order to exemplify the ethical, one must make the movement of infinite resignation, surrendering one's individual desires to the greater good of the universal. But to have faith, one must go further and make another movement, a leap of faith into the absurd, where the individual again becomes important in a direct relationship with God. The religious is distinguished from the aesthetic because only the religious demands this double movement, whereby one renounces everything and then regains everything by virtue of the absurd. Now, turning towards the core of the book, the first of the three problemata asks the question: is there a teleological suspension of the ethical? Telos is a Greek word meaning end or goal. The question of whether there is a teleological suspension of the ethical asks whether there might be some higher cause, some higher end goal, which might cancel out our ethical obligations. According to Hegel, there is none. The universal as expressed in the ethical is the highest telos there is. However, Abraham is willing to murder his son for his own sake only, but and not for the benefit of any higher ethical principle. According to Hegel, then Abraham is a murderer. Johannes suggests alternatively that there is a teleological suspension of the ethical, that Abraham suspended his ethical obligation to Isaac on behalf of some other higher telos, the telos of faith. Faith is the paradox that the single individual can rise above the universal. If this is not the case, then Abraham is lost and faith has never existed, precisely because it has always existed. Faith is a category that is impervious to thought because it cannot be mediated. Mediation takes place by virtue of the universal, and faith is above the universal. Abraham's ethical relationship with Isaac is that the father should love the son more than himself. Because he does not follow this ethical principle, he is not a tragic hero. He is either a murderer or a knight of faith. According to Hegel, all thought takes place by virtue of mediation. Two conflicting ideas can be mediated into a synthesis, which is then brought into conflict with a new antithesis, and so on. But this mediation takes place on the level of ideas that can be expressed, that can be understood by all, and which are thus universal. Because Abraham's ordeal is not universal, but is rather the experience of the single individual, it cannot be mediated. Because it cannot be mediated, it cannot exist in the realm of thought. It cannot be understood. It cannot be ethical. Johannes presents three examples of fathers sacrificing children without moving beyond the ethical. Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia so that the Greeks would win the Trojan War. Jephthah sacrificed his daughter because he promised God a sacrifice if he should defeat the Ammonites, and Junius Brutus put his sons to death for plotting against the state. In each case, though, these fathers kill their children for the good of their people as a whole and can thus be understood and wept for as tragic heroes. But Abraham, on the other hand, is not at all related to the universal. His is a private matter between himself and God. He acts only for God's sake. God demands a proof of faith, and for his own sake, to prove his faith, which are ultimately one and the same. Abraham experiences temptation, but this temptation is the ethical itself, that which might hold him back from his duty to God. Hence, the need for the category of the religious. Because speech expresses the universal, Abraham cannot speak about his ordeal, nor can he be understood or wept for like a tragic hero might. He might arouse our admiration, but he also appalls us, since what he does is a sin according to the ethical. The paradox is that he places himself as a single individual in an absolute relation to the absolute. He is not justified by anything universal, but precisely by being a single individual. Now, the second problemata asks, is there an absolute duty to God? Johannes again defines the ethical as universal, which he in turn associates with the divine and with duty to God. Every duty is a duty to God insofar as God is the divine, is the universal. For instance, it may be my duty to love my neighbor, and this duty as an ethical duty is a duty to the universal and thus to God. However, Johannes notes, we have no direct relation to God through these duties, but only an indirect relation according to which our duties may be traced to God. Hegel suggests that the outer or exteriority is higher than the inner, as what is outer is publicly expressed as is the universal. If this is so, Johannes suggests Hegel is wrong to speak about faith and about Abraham as he does. Faith is that paradox that the inner is higher than the outer, that the single individual can relate absolutely to the absolute as a single individual. Though not invalidated, the ethical becomes relative, and the single individual's absolute duty is to God. This duty to God as absolute cannot be mediated and thus cannot be expressed in the universal. The mainstream position in Kierkegaard's day and in our own that there is no absolute duty to God is most convincingly put forward by Kant. He argues that we can only be autonomous and responsible for our own moral actions, moral choices, if we act not in obedience to some external law, but in accordance with laws that we freely will ourselves. I cannot rationally justify my actions by saying God told me to, but only by saying that I acted of my own free will in accordance with the law that I should wish were universally applied. Kant, followed by Hegel, argues that all moral laws should be universal. For instance, it is never right to lie regardless of the circumstances. Hence, Hegel identifies the ethical with the universal. Johannes moves against this position in suggesting that there is an absolute duty to God. That is, that there are cases, for instance, Abraham's, where one should act in opposition to all universal ethical principles. Johannes argues that the knight of faith acts in total isolation from everyone else. His relation to God is a private one and cannot be justified by an appeal to the universal. Faith, Johannes argues, is precisely that paradox that the single individual is higher than the universal. Though it is noble for the single individual to aspire to be the universal, God may call for actions that cannot be justified in the universal. In acting as a knight of faith, Johannes suggests one is constantly being tested. One is being asked to act against the ethical, to abandon entirely one's own judgment as to what is right, and to act in unquestioning obedience to God. Either Abraham was obeying God or he was a murderer, and it took great faith for him never to question himself or to question God, never to doubt that he might in fact be a murderer. The temptation then is to comply not with faith but with the universal, to do what one knows is right. This temptation is far stronger than any temptation to pursue personal unethical pleasures. The temptation in that case is to do what one knows is wrong. The temptation for the knight of faith is to do what he knows is right. He is constantly being tested because the option to follow his moral judgment is always available to him. This fear in trembling seems appropriate for the constant testing that a knight of faith undergoes. The knight of faith must recognize that it is God who works in him, and that he cannot question or doubt. He must necessarily face this test with fear and trembling, since he is going against the ethical, and he knows that the option to retreat into the ethical is always open to him. This fear and trembling is central enough to the message of the book that Kierkegaard chose it as a title. No doubt, the choice of title was partly inspired by Kierkegaard's poetic flair, but it also suggests a spirit of Christianity that he feels is lost in his age. In an age when Hegel's universal is esteemed, in which the public, the outer, the open is valued, we lose a sense of the privacy and the anxiety with which one enters into a relationship with God. Johannes suggests that either this privacy exists and Hegel is wrong, or Abraham is a murderer. With typical irony, he leaves it to the reader to decide which is correct. The third problemata asks, was it ethically defensible for Abraham to conceal his undertaking from Sarah, from Eliezer, and from Isaac? Johannes opens by defining the ethical as universal and infers from this point that it is disclosed. By contrast, this single individual is hidden. Unlike Greek tragedy, which is blind and thus unaware of its hiddenness, modern drama has become reflective and sees itself. Hiddenness is no longer a result of the hero's ignorance, but is rather the hero's free act. Johannes writes that, as universal, the ethical is also the disclosed. When a person conceals anything, they are sinning and can only rectify it by becoming more open. For this reason, unless Johannes can establish that there are situations in which the individual, as a being higher than the universal, can ethically justify concealment, then Abraham can be rightly condemned for not telling Sarah, Eliezer, and Isaac about God's command. The tension for the aesthetic hero is that he is always free to speak up. His secrecy violates the demands of the ethical, and if he were to explain himself, he could easily be understood. He remains hidden by choice, not by necessity. In this way, the aesthetic hero is distinguished from the knight of faith, who has no choice but to remain hidden. The knight of faith cannot speak because he cannot be understood. Both the aesthetic and the religious deal with the single individual in isolation from the universal, but the aesthetic deals with the single individual who isolates himself in an attempt to relate to the ethical as a single individual, whereas the religious deals with the single individual whose faith brings him above the ethical. After recalling a few stories to emphasize this point, Johannes turns his attention back to Abraham, who didn't tell Sarah, Eliezer, or Isaac about God's command to sacrifice Isaac. Aesthetics says that it's okay to be silent if silence saves everyone else. For obvious reasons, this can't be applied to Abraham's story. Abraham is actually in outrage, aesthetically speaking. Aesthetics might understand a person's decision to sacrifice themselves, but not one person sacrificing another for their own sake. Ethics demands disclosure, which is why ethics loves the tragic hero who acts for the universal and is disclosed somehow. Abraham, however, remains silent and does nothing for the universal. Unless the individual can stand in an absolute relation to the absolute, ethics reigns supreme, and Abraham is neither an aesthetic nor a tragic hero. Abraham's anguish and distress are rooted in the fact that he cannot speak and be understood, that he must be silent. This is because no universal terms can help anyone understand that Abraham must sacrifice Isaac because he loves him and because God has given him a trial. There is something a tragic hero cannot understand, in part because they've given counter arguments the chance to be heard. Abraham cannot do this. His family would ask him why he would sacrifice Isaac if he could just as easily choose not to. And if Abraham looks to them for comfort, they will think he's a hypocrite. There is simply no way for Abraham to speak without compromising his identity as a faithful man. Although Abraham cannot speak, he is simultaneously making the movement of faith, which tells him that Isaac will not really be lost. This comforts Abraham in his silence. The main point of Problemata 3 is that, though the ethical calls for disclosure, Abraham could not speak. While it may not be ethically defensible for Abraham to conceal his undertaking, Abraham's relation to God brings him above the ethical. And so Abraham enters into a private relationship with God. As a result, this command isolates Abraham from the universal. Because the command is unique and private, it cannot be transmitted to other people in an understandable manner. Kierkegaard ends the book with the same paradox, that either this paradox exists, which is that the single individual stands in an absolute relation to the absolute and above the ethical, or Abraham is done for.